So I guess this is my cue to remind you all of our vacd challenge. So check out the Cloud Skill Challenge in the link down here. And stay tuned because we have a lot of cool sessions coming up. Especially the next session. That's one that at least I've been looking forward to. So I see Maarten is already with us.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us on this very special day. And I have to admit that even though I am a bit starstruck by having what I call the Sentinel Master Ninja with us, I do have a non-technical question. Okay. But that's just from my personal interest. I know you love flying and you actually are a pilot for, small airplanes. So not the big jumbo-sized. But how is that in these time of COVID? Does that mean that the sky is now the limit because there are less flights happening? Or did you have to switch to virtual flying to make your flight hours?
Yeah, no, I've been very privileged to be able to fly this year. And like you said, especially in the beginning of the year when most flights were grounded or not just there was this unique month where we actually could cross Schiphol Airport and on a light airplane, so a one propeller Cessna, we could do a flyby of the tower and try and land on the big airstrips as if we were a big plane. So it's been a lot of fun this year to fly, but certainly the clouds are the limit. And I must admit that with the Flight Simulator 2020 coming out in the fall, I've also spent some time flying virtually, but nothing beats going up in the air in a real airplane.
Okay, so basically I'm now gonna take this opportunity to say that I would love to join you on a flight. And then make sure that we're focusing back on the technical coolness that you're going to
consider it done. What we'll do is we'll go up in the air and visit the Azure Western Europe data center in Middenmeer, which you can see from the air.
Oh. I love how you built the theme back right into it.
You're so lucky.
You can join as well, Jorrit. No problem.
Yeah, great. That's great. Thanks. That was an open invitation. All right. So about your session, you're going to do a session about security. Well, I mean, if there's one guy in the Netherlands who knows all about security, it's you. So, also you're well known for being a founder of Experts Live, right? Esther's been there last year. I've seen her there. So, really, we can't wait to see what your session will be about today. So, let's take it away.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll start right away because we have 8 tips to share with you today. And let me get to my presentation. 8 easy steps to improve your security posture in Azure is what I've called it. And we did the introduction already. People might know me. If not, I'm an MVP. Try to specialize on Azure and security. And the thing I wanted to convey today is that we're in this new cloud and hybrid world that we need to defend. So we need to shift away from just on-premise focus with largely network-based protections and detections to something that fits our cloud world. And things are different there. We have potentially endpoints directly to the internet. We have different types of resources like the platform services, but certainly there's a connection back into the hybrid and on-prem world. So we need to figure out how we can defend this new world. And this would mean that we need to adopt a cloud defender mindset. So instead of just a server, we need to figure out what services are running and how are they exposed and how can we protect them. Same goes for Active Directory, Forest, and Domain, largely now subscriptions, tenants, and resource groups and whatnot. The highly privileged users from domain admins, we need to figure out subscription admins or other types of credential access. The credentials themselves are now not just a passkey hash or some kind of credential pivot there, but they're really just other types of things we need to figure out. private IPs are now public IPs, ACLs, other network types like NSGs or Azure Front Door, and we need to figure out how to protect management APIs. So my first tip would be, let's figure out that we don't expose too much to the internet or other networks. Restrict access to your resources is pretty key to make sure that even though resources could be discovered through some sort of zero-day, they can't pivot away to potentially other types of networks or resources. So whenever you're creating resources in Azure or any other cloud for that matter, don't just accept the default ports. Make sure that you understand which ports you are opening, of course, to any of the networks that it will be connected to. Think if you can use a private link or other types of internet or connectivity and access. And that is a real thing, because I'm not sure if you know, if you've ever spun up a VM that's either Linux or Windows and you had the default ports open like 22 or 3389, you'll instantly see hits coming from massive crawlers that are trying to brute force passwords and figure out if you've tried any of the light passwords to get in. So one of the things you could consider there is just-in-time access. That's a feature from Azure Security Center, where you could say, well, even if I need a default port for a certain app, I won't have it open all the time. I'll only request to open it for a specific endpoint, maybe my company or my home address, and for a specific duration, and potentially with some approval step in between. And that means that we'll have it open for a short period of time to do our administrative access and then automatically have it close again. Now, this is part of Azure Defender and Security Center, and we'll have a look at that in a second. The other thing, of course, is that the Azure networking options are a load. There's lots of options for you to consider, and not just opening ports or closing ports through a network security group. Those are often common and things you need to figure out, but we talked about private links and some of the VNet peering potentially, but also Azure Front Door to expose your applications safely. Of course, the Azure Firewall, and the interesting thing about Azure Firewall is that it can also give indicators of compromise to your Azure Sentinel environment through the Security Graph API, so something that adds some of the indicators and things there. And of course, you could have a look at the third-party virtual appliances and make sure that we do something that makes a lot of sense for networking. Now, if you need access to any of your resources in Azure that are a VM, like a Linux or a Windows VM, you're of course probably figuring out how to get SSH or RDP access. And one of the things you might try is to do it on a different port. But again, those massive crawlers on the internet will try a lot of ports and even grab potentially some of the high ports that you're using. So consider Azure Bastion, which is a fully managed platform service in Azure that actually then shields your VMs from direct access, but you go through Azure Bastion to gain access. It provides you with secure SSH and RDP access. Those are the things you can do through your regular programs, but there's also like a web portal. You can use a web URL to get a screen in your browser. Now, Bastion itself is provisioned in your VNet, so you get a Bastion instance in the VNet where your VMs live, and Bastion itself would then be configured to access the outside internet. And it supports connectivity from Bastion to your VMs using SSL, so encrypted traffic, so no snooping in between on the VNet itself. And it just needs one public IP address to the internet. Your resources itself, the VMs, can just have internal IPs and no need to have any public IPs on them, which potentially makes things even easier for you to disclose. So if these are VMs and you need administrative access, do have a look at Azure Bastion before you do other things. This is a great service that's provided out of the box. I would say the second tip is figure out how to secure your identity. And identity is, of course, key. You've seen a lot of people talk the last years that identity is the new control plane. You authenticate yourself and then get authorizations to the resource you need. And in all of these steps, we can have built-in security measures to make sure that no rogue people get access to identities and that only corporate and allowed users are in. Azure AD is key to any good security strategy, I would say. So it's not about networking just, it's not about getting SIMs in there or other protective measures. Make sure you get your Azure AD right and make sure you have a good security strategy. Certainly if you're using, let's say, accounts from other tenants, maybe look at things like Azure Lighthouse to safely make sure that you, and from an auditable way, get access to all of these resources. It's also very important from the sheer fact that often your Azure AD will be connected to your on-prem AD through AD Connect or some other mechanism. So if those credentials will be grabbed from your Azure AD, then there is potential for those hackers and adversaries to come into your on-prem network through the credentials they've gained and the access it gives them. So Azure AD is key, and it's not something to think of lightly, I would say, because it potentially gives access to other things than just your Azure Cloud or your Office 365 tenant. The other thing we're seeing is that attacks on identity are accelerating, right? We see so much automation, we see scale from the cloud for attackers as well. So they're trying to find, again, brute forcing mechanism, password sprays, all sorts of mechanisms to compromise your identity and get in. So the attacks are accelerating, so certainly make sure you get this right. And a key metric is that 60% of cyber attacks often start with some sort of compromise of an identity through spear phishing, through password sprays, through brute forcing and dictionary attacks. But a lot, and at least more than half, start with an identity attack. So this is not something to just look away from. Now, the identity is under constant attack. A lot of attacks, 2 years already, and it must have been grown over the past years, of course. 350,000 password spray attacks just in 1 month, 4.6 billion attacks in breach replays that year, and 23 million risk events in that same month in 2018. So each day there's just hundreds of millions of logins attempts, and you could be one of them that trying to target, and make sure you don't become one of them. So what can you do here? Well, maybe have a look at Azure AD Identity Protection, because that already gives you some automated detection and remediation. It has machine learning in there to find out certain patterns in logins in your tenant, in other tenants combined. And it combines it with insights from Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, where they have a look at things like nation state actors and so forth. And all of these things combined in AAD-IP will then make sure that accounts get flagged or closed or blocked even before bad things happen. It's part of Azure Active Directory. Now you do need a separate license, but these signals can then be fed into other parts of AAD or your environment as well. So think about conditional access, making sure that if we find risky users or risky logins, that conditional access steps in and prohibits access from that device or from that account before further damage happens. And these same signals can also be fed into your SIM, so potentially Azure Sentinel, any of the other third parties, and make sure that we use them as indicators of compromise in our bigger use cases. Microsoft analyzes 6.5 trillion signals per day, so they are well equipped to find the things that matter, and their machine learning is top-notch. They really find the things that help you prevent attacks. Another thing to consider is the Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, PIM. Just-in-time access for your identity, like we saw on the VM. We can make sure that we control access, that you can only get things like global rights or specific roles in AAD based on the request you're doing, based on things like validating your multi-factor, so your extra factor. But it prevents you from permanently assigning and having rights when you're not needing them. Again, PIM is built into Azure AD. You do need a separate license, which you see here on the screen. But other than that, eligible users could then require MFA, maybe require approval step before they get that role, and or specify a reason why they're actually requesting that role, which then certain management roles can then approve. The great thing about PIM but also identity protection, also Lighthouse, I would say any Azure identity related service, is that it's auditable and that we can alert on it. They will be logged into things like Azure Activity and some of the other logs. And then we can also, in our investigation or in our hunting, use that as signals or see certain behavior from either bad actors or rogue internal users and make sure that we handle them accordingly. So AAD PIM, highly recommended in any environment, I would say. Of course, the third tip is understand your current status. Look at, again, that Cloud Defender mindset. Do we know how our environment is currently running, which endpoints are exposed to the internet, which accounts have a risky flag to them? And that's hard potentially in cloud because there's so much to look at. Things change over and over and again. Without security controls in place, a lot of the breaches take months to discover or even longer. And in 2019, there was a 95% increase in cost of a breach. So the cost that a company has when a breach happens, when they get downtime or certain services go down. So what could help there? Well, I would say have a look at Azure Security Center because for one, it can protect your Azure workloads, prevent certain things from happening, like the just-in-time access or more. But more importantly, it gets you insights in the current status of your subscriptions. So how are things configured? Are you doing the right, do you have the right controls in your setup, in your environment? There's a free and pay tiers. So some of these more advanced options might be in a pay tier, but certainly the free tier will give you all of the insights. And I would say there's no reason not just to enable it and get this at a glance overview, because it gives you recommendations. It gives you remediation, the one-click remediation button to say, well, okay, I might not have configured it yet, but if I click this button, it will be configured and I'm protected from that point on. And of course, it's the home of Azure Defender, where we can then have things like workload protection on your VM, like the Windows and Linux EDR, but also on things like your Kubernetes cluster, container scanning, all sorts of things that are very, very interesting to figure out if we have any potential security risks going on. Now, because your environment is changing, machines get added, maybe resources get changed, deployments happen, your cloud environment will be going up and down. Azure Security Center can then help get you insights through some of these dashboards where you see Azure Defender and you see all of the things happening and potentially the insights to work from. Now, let me switch quickly to a demo. Here we are. I'm logged into our demo environment and we're in the Azure portal, as you can see. And the first thing we'll do is we'll have a look at Azure Security Center. In my Azure Security Center, I get launched into an overview page and I see there's one Azure subscription and there's 30 active recommendations as well as 13 security alerts. There's also a button to go into your secure score. Of course, this is arbitrary, but still it gives me an at a glance information about my current status, which says, well, there's potential to improve because only 1/3 of all of the recommendations are applied to the subscription. And when I click on the subscription and go deeper, I find that there's a lot of things I can still do. There are users that don't have NFA enabled. There are vulnerabilities potential that we need to fix. And again, there's the quick big fix, the one-click button to fix things that you can use as you have the rights to make sure that some of these things go away as part of the recommendations that Microsoft gives you. So these are things that happen a lot, that help you a lot, and that you can just have a look at. Now we can also go back to the security alerts. The security alerts are the things we talked about earlier, things like massive crawlers on the internet trying to do a brute force attack. Here we go. that luckily failed. So again, my password and setup is apparently a bit more secure, but they're trying, and it gives you information on certain things happening in your environment. And these are the two VMs, like VM Linux EDR, that then gets targeted by this crawler. There's also regulatory compliance. So if you are in an industry that you need to adhere to things like PCI for the financial industry, maybe ISO, or maybe just want to make sure that I comply with the Azure CIS standards, you can go into Azure Security Center, and based on the categories, it tells you, well, you're not adhering to the Identity and Access Management Chapter 1.2 and 1.1. But you are adhering to the one in Chapter 2. And again, from here, we can just be very actionable, go into the alerts, maybe quickly fix it, and jump, make sure that we are more protected. If you go into the Azure Defender node, we see that, and again, this is part of more the standard and paid options, that we can do things like a vulnerability assessment. We see 15 VMs unprotected, the just-in-time VM access we talked about, some of the application controls, container image scanning, all sorts of neat things to make ourselves more secure. And here with the just-in-time access, I can click a VM and start enabling it so that we only have ports available for a certain period in time. So these are the things that I would say help a lot, and Azure Security Center is a great option to look at. Going back to the slides. Tip 4 would be, let's dive a bit deeper into that environment, because Azure Security Center gives us at a glance view. You can look at regulatory compliance, but if you remember this quote from John Lambert, the head of Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center, then he says, defenders think in lists and attackers think in graphs. And as long as this is true, attackers win, because it's almost undoable to fix every and all resources in your environment. So trying to get to 100% state will be a hard thing to do. Often attackers and adversaries are trying to find the shortest way to their goal. What's the minimum steps I need to do to get certain role or data? And how can I compromise these steps like a VM or some other resource to elevate my privileges and grab that data? So they're thinking in graphs, a short way, a route, if you will, to a certain resource. Now, one of the things that people might know from the on-prem AD is a tool called Bloodhound. It's an open source tool, freely available, great stuff from the people at SpectreOps, but they've released an Azure AD version of it a couple of days ago, I would say. It uses the graph theory to reveal hidden and unintended relationships in your Active Directory, forests, and domains, but now again also in your Azure AD environment. There's two parts to it, which you can run independently. There's a collector, a PowerShell script that you run with your privileges to get all of the resources, all of the potential connections between them, and it saves them in a big zip file. And then there's a visualizer, a front end, the UI that you import the zip file into, which is backed by a Neo4j database that then allows you to understand and pivot through those graphs. Now, the Azure Hound is the name of the PowerShell module for the collection. It collects it from all of the tenants and subscriptions that your user can read that you run it with, and again outputs a zip file. If you combine it with SharpHound, which is the name of the on-prem AD tool, you get a full view. So on-prem to Azure attack paths. And from what we've seen, about 100K user environment takes about 60 minutes to collect, which is a reasonable number. You can run it every now and then, I would say, or at least once to get the data in. And it discovers things like tenants, Azure users, security groups, apps, service principals, all of the things that might interest you. Here's a quick screenshot. So you can look at an environment, take a specific resource and say, give me the shortest path to here. Cool. Let's jump back into the demo. I did the discovery and the collection ahead of time for this demo environment. So I've already collected the zip file to save a couple of minutes. The Neo4j database is running, and I can go into the app Bloodhound, there's a Windows and Mac version, and log into the database. And I could start looking at a certain resource. Let's take that VM again. And I can say, well, give me the shortest path to here. And what you quickly see now is that this gives the information on how to compromise this VM. What roles would I need? What user has what access where? And so the shortest path would be any of those 4 or 5 routes. This is what an attacker cares about. So these are the things that might be high priority for you. Priority 1 to start fixing, make sure it's hardened or protected before you might take on any of the other things in your environment. So pivoting through these graphs and making sure that you understand these resources and the path to them helps. And again, if you combine them with your on-prem AD, you could figure out how to get from a regular user to domain admin, enterprise admin, and global admin all the way, and what steps to undertake to protect them. So Bloodhound, really, really great tool and something for you to consider. Tip 5, implement endpoint detection and response, EDR, on your workloads. We talked about Azure Defender before. We'll talk about Microsoft Defender now. EDR is not antivirus, just. Antivirus is often signature-based, heuristics-based, the things we know already, and it helps. We need to make sure that we have the low-hanging fruit and cover them. But EDR is really also looking at patterns and things happening in your environment and starting to learn from there. So it's focused on patterns and behavior, I would say the known unknowns that we can start to block. And Microsoft Defender now has EDR block mode, so you could really prevent them as they start happening potentially in your environment and before anything else happens. This will be part of Azure Defender if you roll that out to VM. So if you're applying Azure Defender to a Linux or Windows VM, Microsoft Defender under the hood gets enabled, and you could start using all of this technology. Of course, it then reports back into your centralized console, Azure Security Center, or maybe the Microsoft Defender console if you're using that as well for your clients, let's say the Windows 10 clients on your network. And the great thing is it uses KQL, so you could do some advanced hunting and use that raw data to get a bigger picture if you're doing some investigation or hunting. Now, these are the things you get with Microsoft Defender, not just EDR, but there's also threat and vulnerability management. So understanding the current version and all of the other things in your environment, and maybe you need to patch some of these. ASR rules to make sure that we don't get any, let's say, child processes from your Office applications that spawn macros, PowerShell, and anything worse from there. The next generation protection, the EDR, and some auto investigation and remediation, which is neat because you might want to collect some evidence or maybe start shutting down some processes that get spawned. And this is something you can do from the console. So the Microsoft Defender really helps, and with the new Microsoft Defender 365, you could also get information from Cloud App Security, Defender for Identity, again, Defender for Endpoints to make sure you get the bigger picture. Now let's log back into the demo environment. I'll go back to my browser and go into Microsoft Defender here and open up some of these alerts. Now, in my environment, it says we have possible Cobalt Strike detected, which is a problem in and by itself because it is often used by adversaries as a framework for automation and command and control. And it comes to that conclusion based on 4 alerts that are happening. So this is something to look at. Looking at the machines in my environment, I see, okay, this is coming from a certain computer. And if we log into that computer, it gives us information on the risk level, the exposure level from our threat and vulnerability management. We see the logon user, Tyrell apparently is using this one. And we can go to the alerts tab, go, for instance, to the suspicious process injection and get some more information on what's happening. And when we have a look, that's interesting because that tells us that some Explorer exe was spawned that then started excel.exe that then had some execution host run DLL and then got blocked by AMSI, the macro inspection. and it started launching scripts. So this is certainly something that is worth looking in, and that will, if you have EDR in block mode, would have prevented from happening altogether. And it gives us also information that it's happening to Tyrell, which is apparently a senior vice president. So I would say a VIP user to start worrying about quite a bit. If you go into the alert details, and really nice things like mapping it back to the MITRE attack framework, getting some information on what is process injection, which actor groups are using it, how can we do further investigation and so forth. So mapping it back to MITRE is really a big thing. If you're worried about information altogether, like what actor groups and how do they operate, well, the great thing is there's a threat analytics page in Microsoft Defender. So if I say Cobalt Strike, I actually get information on, let me hit enter, information on Cobalt Strike. So Cobalt Strike hiding in the red, there's information, there's links, one device that now is potentially hit by Cobalt Strike. But the threat analytics I've seen is very spot on. You want to know things about WannaCrypt, about zero logon, new Emotet spikes, everything happening, PowerShell Empire. This is the place to go, and certainly a great strength of the Microsoft Defender suite. And it all to give you information on how things work. Let me dive into this. Here you see it before, the T numbers from MITRE, the steps that PowerShell Empire takes, and the protections you could apply. So these are really, really neat things to look at. Okay, that was tip 5. Tip 6, set up security monitoring. Yeah, why not? Make sure that we have some sort of tripwire, that we're understanding what's happening. And of course, this is my intro into Azure Sentinel. You're having Azure Defender in your environment. You're having Microsoft 365 Defender in your environment. Really, really good. Couple of consoles to work with. How about combining it and getting it into a bigger picture? Enter stage Azure Sentinel. So Azure Sentinel has been Microsoft's cloud native SIEM, launched last year, has been received with great success, is what we're seeing. Limitless cloud speed and scale, it lives in Azure, that matters a bit. There's machine learning built in, easy integration with some of the connectors, and you only pay for what you use. These connectors are not only Microsoft based, it's for connecting AWS, your network environment. The good thing is there are also free connectors for which you don't pay for your data ingestion or storage. Things like the Office 365 connector or the Azure Activities, again, already very worthwhile in your environment to understand the identity attacks potentially occurring. So one SIEM for all your clouds, AWS, Azure-based workloads, no problem at all. And really neat investigation UI to dive deeper and not just stare at a bulk of text, but really use your cognitive skills to dive deeper and get a bit of more information. Again, diving back into our Azure environment, we have a Azure Sentinel workspace set up. And what we'll do is I'll set it back to the last, 60 or 90 days. So we have a bit more of information in our screens. And we see that things are happening and things get collected. I've got a couple of data connectors configured. There's 61 in total available and more coming almost weekly. 12 of them connected, of course, the Azure Activity and Office 365. Again, they're free, but also Azure Security Center. I've connected Cloud App Security. Pretty much all the things in my environment are reporting back into Azure Sentinel. You get analytic rules out of the box. Here we go. I only have a few really enabled at this point, but you'll see already the power of those. But there's a ton of rule templates here. If I search for PowerShell Empire again, here's one where it's fully configured, again, with all of the tactics from MITRE, the security event table it will be using that's ingesting data. So it's turning green that I can use it. Just create rule and you'll be all good to go. Now going back to the incidents, taking a sample incident, maybe going back to that suspicious process injection we just saw. there's actually a button for us to click on Investigate, and we get at a glance view of the things happening we just saw. We see suspicious process injection, we see the same desktop, we see Excel and all of the things we need to worry about, but clicking on entities gives us all of the things, the hashes of the files, the people involved. But we also can click on things like timeline and see, oh, there's some sort of malware that was prevented, but after that we saw a suspicious process injection, so might need to look a bit further on the things happening. So this is really, really powerful and something to consider. Okay, tip 7, think use cases, not just alerts. And this is important to me because if you'll just be going after alerts one by one, you'll be chasing your tail. There's a ton of unusual sign-in activities, people working from home, maybe from another IP address, maybe they go out and about, and nowadays working from the office is seen as an anomaly, I would say. So there's so much things and so many alerts that come at you, and what are the real things that you need to figure out that have a high priority like we just saw? Well, let's take an example. Let's say at 9:13, we saw an unusual login from Indonesia, maybe from a user that's normally not in Asia and specifically there. So maybe a VPN, maybe something else happening. But at 9:13, we also saw an anonymous IP, maybe a Tor exit node or some VPN anonymizer was found, and they're combined. And we're now starting to think, whoa, this is not good. And a couple of minutes later, half an hour later, we see a suspicious PowerShell script getting executed on that endpoint. Bad things, something we need to look at. And then the last thing that we discover is an inbox forwarding rule just after, potentially for data exfiltration. And by now your MDR or SOC would probably have called you, and bad things are happening. So the use cases where you're combining 2 or more alerts together to really get a good number of true positives, I would say. Here's an example, compromised account leading to Office 365 mailbox exfiltration. Again, you can build them yourselves, but they also are built into the product. There's a great tool from Puyan, Kapazi, and our colleagues from Wortel that can get you things to do automated, which is called the Azure Sentinel PowerShell module. Get some of the analytics in, some of those use cases, really easy to do with the PowerShell module. Going back to the demo environment, going back into Sentinel quickly, there's a new tab called Entity Behavior. If I say VM Linux EDR, the machine we were looking at in this session, it gives us at a glance information of the things happening. I need to set the last 90 days, of course. Not sure why it's flipping back in certain parts of the UI. And now click on it, we'll see the same timeline again. Reverse shell was found. Ooh, whoops, that's bad. And we can click a bit further. So this is really something that helps. Those are KQL based, as you see. If I go into Visual Studio, here are some of the use cases we've recently built: impossible travel, CI/CD bypass, all of these things you could put in a JSON file. And again, with the Azure Sentinel module, make sure that you get those in your environment in an automated way. Last tip, apply security anywhere with Azure Arc. Azure Arc, one of the new services that spans the ARM control plane into places it's not been before. So you can use Azure Arc to attach to existing Windows, Linux, and Kubernetes resources wherever they live. Manage them as any other Azure-based resource. Brings the ARM into any environment it's not been in before. Let's think AWS, let's think on-prem, let's think the hosting data center you have some stuff in. One control plane for you to rule over your clouds for management, but certainly also for security. There's Azure Arc for servers, Azure Arc for Kubernetes, Azure Data Services that you can use. Azure Defender spans through Azure Arc and uses Azure Arc. So you can enforce compliance and auditing on any of the resources, even if they don't live in Azure. Still manage them from a unified portal, view and remediate them as you would in Azure, and really gives you multi-cloud security protections. Conclusion, Azure has a lot of built-in controls that you can use. for identity, network, data security, threat protection, and security management. I would say that's the reason Forrester said, make no mistake, Microsoft is a security company now. Great quote. Want to know more about Azure Sentinel? We've released an ebook, so go ahead and download it for free. I'll post a link to Twitter again, or stay up to date through my blog, maartengoet.org, or my podcast, securityinsiders.io. And this was what I actually had prepared. So thank you for tuning in.
Well, thank you for giving us this session, Maarten.
My pleasure.
I hope there's not a lot of background noise, but it became a bit chilly in the studio, so we have an extra heater on right now. So yeah. I hope that's not interfering with the stream, and you can still hear us loud and clear.
Exactly. Hopefully. Yes. So, we have some questions for you, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first one that came in through the Twitch was if there will be any MAC identifying possibilities for filtering on MAC addresses, your security rules in Azure.
In which product they meant? Did you get more information on?
Yeah, I would assume
you want to apply it?
On network firewalling, network connectivity, probably around that area.
Okay, well, I need to understand more about the question. Feel free to do a follow-up question on Twitter, and I'll help answer. But I'm not sure where you would want to apply MAC filtering at this point.
Okay, well, we will take it to you personally then. Thanks. The other one is if there are any certifications that you would recommend if you are learning from the beginning around Azure security.
I think there's a ton of stuff. Of course, the AZ 500 certification is good. There's a ton of things they ask from all of the security products that are great. If you want to dive into things like identity security, we've seen great courses from other providers like the pentesteracademy.com. If you want to get more on the offensive side, of course, there's a ton of things there. I would say some of the SUNS courses are really, really good. So, ton of things. I'll do some suggestions on Twitter. If you have your own suggestions, feel free to add to them.
Okay, so next one is about your slide deck. If you're willing to share it after this session somewhere.
Absolutely. We'll figure out how to get them to the audience.
Okay.
Yes, please, because you already made me aware of some of the rookie mistakes that I'm making, connecting to my Azure environment and forgetting to use Azure Bastion. And I hope nobody heard that and is gonna hack my demo environment now.
Well, we can all help each other get more secure. So I'll be sure be posting my deck. Yeah.
Thank you. That will definitely help me.
Sure. Okay, so final question for you, and this might be an interesting one. You mentioned Azure Arc for managing your on-premise or your hybrid servers, but there's also Azure Lighthouse where you can manage multiple Azure subscriptions from one and the same tenant. How do they play together? I mean, can you even combine these? Like if you have Azure Arc enabled servers running in a subscription somewhere, can you still manage them through Azure Lighthouse?
I've not tried it personally, but what you see with Azure Arc is that it extends all of the capabilities you have in the public cloud into other places. I would foresee that if not now, then in the near future, that would be a possibility because all of these resources show up as Azure resources through ARM. And Azure Lighthouse is utilizing all of the things we have in ARM. So certainly something to look at, but I would say they play really well together.
All right. Thank you for your info.
Cool. Well, thank you for having me again.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is it for Maarten. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maarten.
And hopefully we will see you next time.
Definitely.
Cheers. Thank you, guys.
All right.